Okay, thanks everyone for joining. We've got Jon Vines here from AO. Really excited to hear about their journey. As always, feel free to jump into the chat and talk back and forth. But if you've got questions that you want, if you can put them into the Q&A, that makes it easier for us to kind of collate them and have one spot. And then people can also upvote if you see a question that you think really is great and you want to answer. But with that, I'm gonna be quiet now and let Jon kind of take over and run the show, and I'll be back for the Q&A. So thanks so much again, Jon, for taking the time, and go ahead.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Scott, and thanks for the opportunity to come along and have a chat with the data mesh learning community today. I'm really excited. I'm going to be talking through some of our early thoughts on data mesh here at AO.com, and particularly around that kind of concept of sharing data, really. So agenda kind of looks like this. We're going to talk about, well, to start with, we're going to talk a little bit about AO and what we do. And then we're going to get into kind of the growth of the organization and why we've kind of got to this point that we're starting to think about data mesh and what we're starting to do. We're going to talk a lot about events as part of this. We've done quite a bit of work in our events platform so far, and that's influenced some of our thinking around the role that events could play in the data mesh. And I'm going to also spend a bit of time talking through the work that we've done around defining and deploying the events available within that event platform. And then I'm going to talk through some of our first steps into that data mesh world and how we've taken some of those learnings from our event kind of implementation and how it will start to influence our data mesh implementations as well. I'm going to start very quickly by saying that I'm going to be very on brand today. So there's going to be lots of green in this this presentation deck. So I just wanted to give you a forewarning. If green's not your colour, I do apologise, but it's all good. I'll start with a bit of an introduction about myself. So my name is Jon Vines. I'm head of data engineering and integration here at AO.com. I'm also responsible for our kind of new data platform build and where things are going in the future as well. So a lot of the conversations we've seen around data mesh so far, a lot of the emerging thoughts that are coming out, are really influencing some of my own thinking and some of the thinking that we're bringing into where we want to take data forward for the organization. I'm from Manchester in the UK, historically famous for cotton, more recently famous for football, as Scott and I was just discussing. And it's also famous for raining quite a bit. We're famous for our rain here in Manchester, but quite fortunately, it's not raining today, so I'll take that as a good day. I also enjoy cycling, and I love reading as well. So if you've got any recommendations after today's talk, please feel free to reach out. We'll gratefully accept any recommendations you've got there. So who are AO.com? Well, we're an online electrical retailer operating within the UK and Germany, and we've kind of got a mission of becoming the destination of choice for electrical retailing. So we have a leading market share with kind of major domestic appliances, or MDA. That's things like washing machines, fridges, freezers. That's probably the thing we're most well known for, but we've got a significantly growing market share across small domestic appliances, computing, consumer electronics, and mobile as well. And it's not just the shop window with AO, so that retail aspect of it, that front door is a big part of it. But we have that kind of full end-to-end operational delivery capability through kind of order management, customer sales, customer care, into warehousing and delivery as well. We kind of hold the whole infrastructure stack straight through. Some results from us last year: group revenue was 1.6 billion. It increased over 60%. There's over 2 million new customers in the UK, and something that we're particularly proud of is that our net promoter scores are super high at 85 in the UK and 89 in Germany, and that's something that we're super proud of. And we've got lots of strategic investment in kind of warehousing vehicles and people to kind of support the growing change in shopping habits to kind of online purchasing and online retail, and that's kind of been accelerated by the pandemic quite a bit as well. So, you know, really getting ourselves into a position to support that and help the organization grow effectively. So this is a massively simplified view. I just want to talk a little bit of kind of where data started and set the scene for why we're thinking about some of the things we're thinking about and where we want to take stuff. But we'll start with that shop window view. It was effectively a number of years ago, you know, that was built around a monolithic web app which had a database kind of supporting in the back end, and there was obviously data flows from that kind of web app database into the analytical plane for our data community, analysts, BI type usages of that data, you know, into quite a traditional data warehouse. And that was okay at the start. So, you know, obviously as the organization's grown and the data needs have grown around it, those traditional approaches around data warehousing and whatnot obviously becomes a harder and harder thing to do well, and that's why we're here talking a data mesh talk, of course. And you know, we see that complexity growing over the years as the tech teams we've got grow, as the number of applications supporting the website and the customer sales, etc., grow. We're seeing a growth in applications across the estate. We're seeing a growth in the databases across the estate, and obviously a growth then in the number of pipelines that are feeding that data warehouse. And what we can see, you know, if we carry on down this route, is that the pressure we're putting on here isn't going to allow us to serve the data needs that we've got as an organization to help us both, you know, understand what's going on, to exploit new opportunities with that data, to exploit and use some, you know, like new data science type capabilities and whatnot, just to kind of, again, help with that customer experience. It all comes back to that customer experience with us. And you know, what we've seen, and certainly what I think a lot of you on the call will recognize, is that, you know, databases aren't really built to be shared across an organization. They're kind of there for a specific use case, and a lot of the things that we see in that kind of data mesh world kind of help us line up with that and explain that in quite a nice way, especially when we start to talk about domain boundaries, etc. on top of that. So I'm gonna spend this next section just talking about then, you know, intentionally sharing data, what that means, and how that kind of mindset shift of starting to you know, like build those different views of data and what you're actually using it for, and what it means, and the benefits it can bring. And you know, particularly, you know, we'll be talking about events a little bit in this part, but also, you know, in the back of your mind, we've got that view of what data mesh brings to the table as well, as part of that. There's a lot of kind of questions that come about around data, and you know, this comes from not only a kind of business perspective, but also a technical perspective as well. You know, we can ask questions like, you know, well, where is the data I need? How do I access it? Can I trust it? Who can access this data? What does this data even mean? Who owns the data? We could list probably a good number of questions just around what happens when we're in a world where we're not intentionally sharing and making that data discoverable, and the consequences of that means that, you know, it's hard to try new things, it's hard to find, it's hard to kind of prepare ourselves for the needs that the organization has kind of going into the future. So this kind of view, again, it's a simplified view, but we're effectively seeing across our integration landscape a picture that starts to look like this a little bit. And what this is representing is, you know, the different communication methods between a number of applications, and the different colors are meant to represent different types of integration approaches, and obviously any kind of integration, the purpose of that usually is either to make something happen operationally, but a lot of the time it's also to say, you know, I need a data of a certain type in a certain kind of format. And what we've seen is, you know, without that kind of shared vision of what integration looks like and data sharing looks like from that perspective, it becomes even harder when we get into that analytical world, particularly, and how we kind of manage that as well. What we started to think about really was how do we start to intentionally share data across that integration layer, and events formed a big part of that, and effectively creating that kind of black box around the domain from an operational perspective, and purposefully sharing data through Kafka across that kind of operational landscape. And this allowed us to kind of build that shared kind of platform for how we, you know, share data across that. It gives us a lot of benefits, of course, as well, around decoupling and options around what we can do with that kind of data as well. But then what became quite interesting, particularly as we started to read more about data mesh, and particularly as we started to see some of the challenges we were facing in that kind of analytical landscape. You know, what is the role that these events could play? Because there's an act of purposefully sharing data in that perspective. And what we saw was that there's actually an opportunity for us to treat these event streams, event topics out of Kafka as a source of truth for a particular domain, and actually feed the creation of data products across that analytical domain. And what this allowed for us to do was then to start thinking about both that event plane and sharing data, but also that data mesh and sharing of data across the analytical data plane as well, all kind of fed from those Kafka topics effectively. And even though this picture looks relatively similar to that kind of first picture, all the lines are the same color. So we're, you know, promoting self-serve capability and promoting interoperability across the sharing of those data products, but also across the sharing of those events and those event streams as well. So I'm just going to very quickly kind of touch on the four kind of principles that come across with data mesh. I'm sure everyone on the call is more than aware of these already, but I'd like to just give a quick reminder of kind of where my head's at with some of these and what they mean. And you know, that first one, domain-driven data ownership, you know, that really speaks home to me a lot around, you know, I'm from a software background predominantly, in some of my past positions and whatnot, and understanding the kind of benefits you can get from that kind of domain-driven design, and applying that to the data world is particularly interesting and makes a lot of intuitive sense to myself. Treating data as a product in a similar way, you know, putting SLAs around that, bringing products thinking, that ownership, quality metrics, etc. And self-serve infrastructure as a platform. Again, all about, you know, promoting kind of agency of teams to solve the problems that are in front of them, you know, and giving them that ability to solve those business problems, but not have to make the low-level decisions that we wouldn't be able to do if we didn't have that platform in place. And then finally, that kind of governance piece, federated computational governance. I'm really thinking about how we can bring the policies that keep our data and our customers' data safe, but applying that as a kind of you know, the guardrails of the platforms and how we approach building that shareable data asset across the organization effectively. So I'm going to talk data planes for the next couple of slides, and this is a view that we typically see with some of the kind of data mesh thinking so far, and that's the split between that kind of operational data plane and the analytical data plane, and the movement of data across those. But as I've already hinted at a few times, our thinking kind of extended to include this middle piece, which is the event data plane. And it's really the combination of the three that allows us to start kind of building up those domain boundaries around this and having that conversation around, you know, how we not only integrate across the organization, but make data available for the business to do what they need to do. And we can see as part of this, you know, the events coming out of the operational data plane into the event platform can become the seed for that analytical data plane and the data products we've got there. But it also becomes, you know, a driver for other operational use cases as well. And this gets really interesting, I think, when we start to blur the lines a little bit between operational and analytical data. You know, as we're generating new insights and we start to see the value in that, you know, how can we move that insight into something that can be used from an operational perspective, you know, and there's discovery through the emergence of those data products that might bring a new opportunity for the organization further down the line as well. And then it's particularly, you know, kind of important to draw that domain boundary around each of these then, and the ownership that goes along with that. And you know, we see with the kind of growth of things like DevOps and cross-functional teams, the impacts that's had from an application perspective, you know, as that came in 10 years ago when there was the situation of dev throwing things over the wall to ops. In a similar way, you know, we're seeing that kind of applications throwing data over the wall to analytics people at the moment, and again breaking down those barriers and creating that shared ownership and shared mission across the planes that we're representing here on this kind of logical view is quite exciting in my opinion. And I think we're in a similar position with data that we were from a DevOps perspective that 10-15 years ago effectively. And then the kind of important insight that we see from this really is then this understanding of data on the inside and data on the outside, and where that applies across those different data planes as we're talking about. And I think, you know, data platforms of years gone by have predominantly focused on that kind of analytical data plane. And with that adoption of events, we're operating now on both like that operational and analytical data plane, and enabling the bits in the middle around how we actually move data around purposefully across the organization. And to help kind of further define those different use cases, again, that conversation around data on the inside and data on the outside becomes particularly important. And I guess the things to think about, some of the characteristics that we see is, you know, data on the inside is private. It's not to be shared. It's not something that we want to allow anybody else really to have access to. It tends to, you know, operationally serve an application's needs. So we can see it, you know, quite transactionally driven, representing the latest state, and really being there purposefully for the, you know, the use case that application is trying to evolve, trying to solve, and we'll see it evolve for those application needs as well. And then data on the outside, you know, is intentionally shared from a domain, and it should be a little bit more stable, you know, so producers are committing to a stable view of that data out of the domain. They should be thinking about employing versioning if there's introduction of breaking changes and that kind of stuff, and thinking about compatibility, you know, forwards and backwards compatibility, and what it means to break the contracts, you know, and really bringing that concept of contracts along with that shared data, and using that as a mechanism for building trust from our consumers, so that they can confidently build, again, not only from an operational perspective, but from an analytical perspective as well. So just want to revisit this before we move into the next section, which talks about, you know, the anatomy of a data product. And I'm going to draw your attention to one of the talks that previously happened on the data mesh learning meetups, which Scott, I think you did. You know, you did a great job of kind of representing the three kind of main pieces across this. But on the left, input data ports, effectively that data flow in, the bit in the middle, the processing, the storage that's needed to provide those data products via the output data ports and how we access them. And I know there's a few bits missing from this around control planes and making those discoverable and stuff like that. But kind of at a broad level, these three things are the meat of the kind of engineering aspect of a data product itself. And the reason I wanted to kind of bring this view up a little bit is because this next piece, this next kind of quote was really quite influential in some of our thinking as well. And that's that there should be no transformation of data before it enters the data product pipeline. So that means the process of going from available data, be it from an adjacent operational source, be it from an upstream data product, or be it from an event stream, as we've spoke about quite a bit today, that should just flow into the data products pipelines for that particular purpose. And we shouldn't be doing any kind of transformation before it gets into that middle bit. And that's quite interesting, because in the world of events and in the world of Kafka in particular, we're talking about immutable data within those logs of events effectively. And it really kind of marries up to this kind of principle around avoiding any transformation before we get into that data product development world itself. So I'm going to spend
Sorry, John, do you mind if I just add a little?
Yeah, jump in.
So, I mean, this is something that Zhamak has talked about. It's because one of the big problems around what's been happening with analytics and why data mesh is needed is that pipelines being a first-class concern around analytics, everything is a one-to-one, right? And so any change that breaks it breaks everything else downstream. And even if you've got that ownership, then somebody might be owning so many pipelines, versus if you own it as a data product, it might be that there are breaking changes, but you make it so that there isn't a breaking change for that consumer, and that you can manage. Okay, it's like being able to change things, but that you're still able to serve your APIs. It doesn't matter that this pipeline is changing if you're still able to serve to your contracts and thing at the data contract or at the contract level via the data output port. So it's something that I hadn't really hit on until I started kind of rewatching a bunch of old content and really digging into it. So I think I'm glad that you're putting this up here, because I think it's something that I think it's pretty easy to skip over and miss about data mesh and data products. So thank you for putting this up. I like that it's single slide.
Well, I think it's really important. I mean, in some of our early experimentation, you can see exactly those characteristics already coming in place. It's the period of experimentation, you're trying things and you're failing quite a lot as well. And one of the reasons you see that is because you've done exactly this in certain places. So yeah, it's a really important principle, I think, personally.
Sorry to interrupt, but I thought
really good. I appreciate it. No, really appreciate it. Thank you, Scott. Okay, so just moving in then to events specifically, and I'm going to talk through both like the role that I think events play in a data mesh a bit more specifically now, but also some of the work that we've done that is starting to inform how we want to approach some of our data mesh implementation as well. So the first thing is what role do I think events can play in a data mesh? Well, I think they can become a source of truth from a domain. We've discussed this a number of times already. I think from a data integration perspective, they can become the predominant way of sharing data across the organization. They're obviously a reusable asset as well, in the sense that we can bring new consumers online in a decoupled way and try new things, which applies as much in that data products world from the analytical layer as it does in that operational layer. I think we can see it becoming a primary ingestion point of input data ports. And then this last one gets quite interesting for me, because I think we can see it also as a potential output of output data ports as well. But one of the big benefits is that we've seen with the build of our event platform so far is that we've actually promoted interoperability out of the domains specifically as well. And we think those characteristics will flow into that implementation of data mesh that we've been building on as well. So what work have we done on events then? So we've spent a bit of time looking at event structure and principles around that. And one of these principles in particular, I think, has been, whilst we weren't thinking about data mesh at the time, it's actually something that enables data mesh in quite a big way, I think. We've done a lot of work on associated metadata, so making sure that we understand what metadata we need to carry along with those events. We've done a lot of work around decorative event and topic definition and automated deployment of that as well. And we've spent a bit of time looking at kind of knowledge graphs around what that event landscape looks like. And I'll dive into each of these in a bit more detail now as well. So what makes a good event? So the image on the right here kind of talks to the kind of general structure of what a message in Kafka looks like. I'll start from that level and then we'll start to dive down into that a little bit more. So messages in Kafka have a header, and what makes it a good use of those headers is if we actually standardize on those and what they mean. And we'll touch on a few of those in a moment. We've got a key, which is effectively a unique identifier for the data entity that's carried along with that message. And these are really important to think about and understand what role it plays with the types of data that you're sharing, be it a sale, be it a product, be it a price associated with the product. And that influences partitioning strategies and downstream processing of that data as well. And then the meat of the message is the value, which is the real kind of event bit, really. And this is, in this space, we need to make sure we have an associated schema. We've made decisions to serialize using Avro, which means that we can use schemas. It means we can register those schemas with schema registry, and we can maintain that contract for producers and consumers. And we've also carried across a principle of ensuring that we approach our kind of message design and message modeling, event modeling, I should say, using the principles of event carried state transfer. There's a really good blog post on this on Martin Fowler's blogs, where he talks about the different types of ways of being event driven, and this one calls out a lot because it enables quite a lot of things. And I don't think we could approach our ways of thinking on data mesh so far if we hadn't actually brought forward this principle of event carried state transfer. So it was kind of a little stroke of luck in some ways, but we think it will be a good enabler for some of our data mesh thinking. And effectively what it means is that an event contains enough data such that consumers don't need to contact the source system to do further work. So that effectively means the entity carried across in the event carries the full and complete state of that entity at the point in time that the event was raised. And that means that consumers downstream, they don't have to call an API, they don't have to go and pull more data from somewhere else to actually go and do the work that they need to do. And what we've seen from an integration perspective is that there's greater resilience with this. There's looser coupling at application level, and there's reduced latency in the form of the unit of work that a particular application needs to do, because they've actually got the data that they need to work on at that point in time. But we've also seen that it introduces more complexity at that kind of consumer level as well. They have to worry about maintaining enough state for a given data entity to combat their operational purposes. And we're expecting that complexity will flow through into our data product design as well. So that's just something to be aware of as far as that. But it's, if events are forming part of your thinking, this principle is a big one to think about, I think. We've then spent a bit of time on event metadata and providing artifacts for tech teams to use as far as kind of producing events is concerned, and that's making sure we've got a unique identifier for every event that's risen, that there's an associated timestamp, that there's an associated source, so we know who's kind of owning it, and that there's a correlation ID, so we can kind of match that lineage across the systems. As our systems become increasingly distributed, that notion of correlation ID and the lineage of the data and the way it's transformed becomes more and more important. And one that's missing off this list is causation ID, which is the ID of the event that caused the new event to happen effectively. So again, it just helps with that lineage and understanding, if things start going wrong or things start looking a little bit different to what we expect, we can match that lineage across. And carrying that through our operational systems is important. We think it'll be equally important in our data mesh implementation as well. Decorative event and topic definition. So we've spent a lot of time and kind of working through what it looks like to define topics and give our teams a kind of standardized approach to how we do that. This screenshot effectively shows what one of those domain files look like, and here we define the name of a domain, we define the name of the kind of application scope within that, and then we define the topic names themselves. We also define who's able to consume from this from a user access perspective, who's actually producing the data, who's actually consuming the data, and have the data models sat around this as well. So we can see both key and value here, and that then also references the schemas that are associated with that. This has brought a number of benefits for us, particularly around kind of standardizing how topics are named. It makes it easier to discover what's out there. It makes it easier to understand what the kind of hierarchy of kind of application, domain to application to topic looks like, and also where that ownership aspect comes in as well. And the other good thing is that it means we've been able to apply some kind of CI/CD around the deployment of new topics. So development teams can come along, define the topics that they need. It goes into a deployment pipeline which validates that it looks as it should do, and then subsequently deploys that state into the Kafka clusters and instances further downstream. And the other benefit is that we can start to think about the knowledge graph that comes along with that. So that decorative approach means that we've got a structure for being able to share what is within those kind of domain files and the relationships between them. And I know this picture is not super clear, but effectively what we can see is the domains which own the consumers and producers and the subsequent topics that they produce and consume from, and the subsequent schemas that they have, and then subsequently if there's any sensitive data further downstream from that. And this is a good way for us kind of understanding that technical lineage as well of how our events are growing and expanding, and what that looks like across the organization. We've learned a few lessons with this as well. At the moment, it's a centralized process. We want to decentralize and give teams even more autonomy to define what they need. There's a few things we need to do with that. We realize that strong guidance and documentation is needed to make sure people are doing the right thing, but also that it's easy for them to get up and running basically and bring new use cases online without that need for centralized expertise. But we have seen a huge jump in consistency across those topics as well. And that makes it a lot easier for us to kind of operate and manage from a platform perspective with what that looks like. So coming to the final bits now, what does this mean for data mesh at AO? So you can probably tell, as far as I've been talking through this, we are at a super early stage with where our thinking is and what we need to do and what we're kind of approaching and what we're going for. And a lot of the things we've learned from purposefully sharing those events has kind of influenced some of our thinking. Just to kind of put that in kind of some plain sight, we do see events as a seed for the data mesh, as a source of truth for immutable shared data out of a domain from an operational perspective, and that it can potentially be an output of data product insight as well. And if I revisit this kind of view of that kind of anatomy of a data product with events, we can see that this is what things start to look like a little bit. Kafka as an input, upstream data products as an input, using things like Kafka streams or KSQL or Spark for potential stream processing opportunities, but also dbt for some of the other types of data processing use cases. And these are all things we're looking at. They're not necessarily decisions made just yet. But then that output data ports as well, particularly if we go down that stream processing route, creating that insight and making it available not only for other analytical use cases, but other operational use cases and the opportunity that brings along as well. And just to kind of start closing down a little bit as well, we've seen a big blurring of the lines between kind of operational and analytical use cases. And one of the things that we're kind of seeing is that we really shouldn't be defining the data itself as operational or analytical. It's the use cases that we're applying to that data that is operational or analytical. And part of our job is to make that data available regardless of the use case, so that the organization can use that to generate insight. They can use it to monitor current performance, or they can use it to drive new and interesting use cases off of the back of that as well. We're seeing that data should be intentionally shared. That ownership piece, again, that data mesh ownership piece particularly helps drive that point home. And we're also seeing that events are further blurring that line, particularly as our event opportunities go further and further, particularly. That leads us to kind of next steps for us. We're looking at decorative deployment of data products, particularly defining input data ports and output data ports, and provisioning the infrastructure that's needed as part of that, and also that bit in the middle of where we need data storage, where we need processing. We're looking at data product registration with data catalogs to make it kind of discoverable, not only from a tech perspective but from an organization perspective as well. And we're looking at how we can bake in those quality metrics and give teams the ability to apply SLAs and profiling around that data and what it means as well. So there's a few streams that we're chasing down. We're highlighting use cases, and as we get to a point where we actually start deploying stuff, I'd love to come back and continue the conversation and see what people think about our approach to that actual implementation. So finishing on a quick wrap up then, we spoke about intentionally sharing data. We've spoke about that vision of the role of events in a data mesh. And we've spoke about that decorative approach to our event platform and the impacts that's having on our data mesh vision as well. And with that, I'll thank you all for your time. I'll pass back to you, Scott. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was awesome, Jon. Thanks so much. And as always, we'll looking forward to the Q&A. If it's all right, I'll take the first one, which was kind of on that point around the operational and analytical. We've, in the Slack and everywhere else, everybody's kind of saying that same thing. It's blurred around, even is this exchange of data, not even is this data used for operational or analytical systems or anything like that, because analytics is operationalized when you think about ML and you think about that.
Yeah.
So have you, I know you're still trying to figure this out, but like, how do you think about, data mesh? It's very much about that intentionality around okay, I need to have this so that this is optimized for people to consume the data, right? That they can do analytics on it rather than it's optimized for those data exchanges that are operational. And so there's kind of this issue with data mesh of people that are trying to, once you get insights, then I'm going to change my data product that produced those insights so that I can use that for that operational data exchange. But then you lose the ability to make further insights from that data. It becomes a specific purpose instead of a general purpose. So, it's a complicated topic and things, but have you figured out, is that more of a people process thing that you think about? And I know you've got your events mesh kind of thing that makes it so it probably shouldn't have that same issue, but like, how would you, if somebody has that insight, have you thought about how you would operationalize that? How would you pull that back in and say, okay, we need to make this a first class concern and put it at the event mesh, or how would you do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It has been on mind a little bit as well, to be honest, because I think, the second you've kind of generated that insight at an analytical layer, as you're saying, you don't want to influence that analytical data to become the purpose for the operational piece. So I think there's a period of like discovery, like the whole point of the analytics side is to generate insight. And once you've got to that point of making some insight, is there, and we're still figuring this out. This is my kind of just on mind from the question, really, to be honest. But like, what's the process then of saying, well, we think there's value in this insight, so what can we do to kind of operationalize that or test it and validate that? And I think we can use those data products if we think about maybe flat files for data scientists, and they're doing what they do. We can use that to influence maybe a period of experimentation or exploitation where we say, okay, let's move this back into that operational layer and see what we can do with it, because that event is the source of truth into that analytics layer. It can also be the source of truth into that new operational piece. And if it doesn't work, you can kind of switch it off and move on to your next piece. So that bit around process, that bit around people, and maybe that bit around purposefully experimenting with some of the insights that you find from an analytical layer, I think it's going to help with that. But it's not a solved problem, absolutely not. There's still a bit of thinking there.
And data mesh, data products in general shouldn't be optimized for latency. It's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And so if that latency is what it doesn't matter if your operational system pulls something in on a daily basis. That latency doesn't matter, right? Like if it's coming in once a day, you can still do that data exchange at the mesh. But if that latency really matters, that's where, it's something that as a community, everybody's kind of trying to figure out. So there's some really great questions in the Q&A. So I want to jump to that as well.
No problem.
If you've got one that you want to pick out, go ahead. Otherwise, I can just read them out to you, whichever you prefer.
Yeah, we'll start at the top if you want us to read them out. That was your question to start with, wasn't it? So keen to understand how that ownership model works for those domains. Where's the line between your responsibilities of engineering and business take precedence and overlap? It's a really good question. We've got a work stream actually going on around that kind of business level ownership and engineering type ownership. And I think the biggest piece is around the accountability that comes with it. Like the business can't really be accountable if they're not involved in that kind of decision making within a team. And that's where the data product owner type role comes in, I think, for us. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I think there's still bits we need to figure out here. We're going from a world where ownership in the way that data mesh talks about it, and ownership with how we've approached data so far, we need to find that kind of convergence and what it means for us. So I think there's still a few lessons for us to learn in this space, to be honest.
Yeah, well, and I think it's different for every company, but like, how much is on the platform is a difficult question, because in a perfect use case world where you've got as many resources as you want, the transformation logic only is owned by the domain, and everything else is owned by the platform. But you also can't say, okay, we're going to offer up 60 different technology pieces in our platform, and we're all these capabilities, and if somebody has something that they want to do that's really kind of crazy and out there, it's something where you kind of have that in the microservices model of, okay, domain, then if you really want to do this in this crazy way, you've kind of got to own it. But if it becomes something that becomes a new standard, or that everybody else goes, oh wow, this is working really well, then yes, push it back to us, and we want to own it at the platform level. So it's an interesting push and pull, but I don't think there's I haven't seen somebody give a right answer, because I don't think there is one. I think everything is, okay, let's figure out what works and evolve it, right?
Yeah.
Kind of the end thing of data mesh is everything evolves.
Yes, absolutely. Cool. Okay, next one. How do you manage your analytic events schema and share across the people who have to implement through to the data engineers? Do you use any specific tools to validate and ensure correctness? I think the first piece is, I don't think we distinguish between events and the schemas, really. I don't think to the initial conversation we have, an operational event and an analytical event necessarily. But what we do use is the schema registry that comes along with the kind of Kafka packages predominantly, and that's kind of where we manage those, and we also share them through that centralized repository, that Decorative piece that I shared a little later on in the presentation. So between that, the knowledge graph, which is kind of custom built, that's kind of where we give people access to those schemas. What we've not solved yet, that's from a very tech perspective. What we've not solved yet is how we share that from a business perspective and discoverability piece as well. And this is where we're looking at more kind of available products in the market. Tools like Calibra, for example, is one thing that's been spoke about from kind of our data governance team as something that we want to bring in. So working out how we kind of marry that up will be quite interesting for us, and I'll be sure to share where we get to with it once we get to that point.
Yeah, well, and I think there's the question of in-flight versus landed. I don't have any insight at all into this, but like Monte Carlo is used by a lot of people in the community or looked at, but that's not in flight. And so, do you want to only check your kind of correctness and validation and stuff once something has landed, or is that in flight? Or does it really matter in most cases? Because the time, especially if you're doing events, the time between when it's in flight and when it's landed is pretty small most times, most likely. And unless you're doing that kind of, we're just going to do one big batch transformation. But it's I mean, I had somebody reach out to me and just say, hey, what vendors do you know that are doing the in-flight stuff? And it's pretty tough to find. I think Great Expectations has some stuff, and that's an open source you can look at. But it's and then how do you think about that kind of validation and correctness from a contract standpoint, right? It might be that the event itself is valid based on the schema and stuff that you're using, but that it might break your contracts if you've had an upstream change, and it's
of course
that versioning aspect of it as well. Of I don't want to get into the contracts thing, but like the contracts to me, should it be that like everybody's got different like micro contracts that they're using so that, when you do have that versioning change that you can say, okay, we're going to move you to the next version because this contract may be broken, but it's not for you because you're not consuming this piece. And my brain just kind of exploded when I started trying to think about that. But it's an interesting topic that I think tooling will evolve in 5 years.
I think that's the thing. Yeah, I think with a lot of these questions, and you see it in the Slack as well, like there's so much that's emergent at the moment, and you've kind of just got to take a bit of a leap of faith in some areas as well, and figure things out and accept that what you try today might be completely the wrong thing in a few weeks. As more thinking emerges around it, and I think just being prepared for that is definitely something you've got to accept on this journey, I think.
Yeah, I think, Zhamak has even said, there's data mesh is still, we need to prove out the different points of it, right? Like there's nothing that's definite that it's even, going to have the ROI and everything that we hope it does. It makes sense to, because again, you're with intentionality setting yourself up that analytics are a first class concern, and that you continue to keep those data products as that first class analytical concern. And then once you get those insights, driving those insights, then you figure out, can I keep that data exchange at the mesh level or not? So but it's a really good question, Steve. So thanks for that.
Cool. Has the drive to implement the standardized metadata and decorative event definition driven lots of topic producer changes, i.e. standardization has been hard conversations? What benefits did you use to drive the change you needed? This is a really good question. I'll be quite honest with you. I think our integration landscape before we brought in the kind of move to standardize on Kafka was quite varied. Kind of a lot of natural organic growth across the organization, and teams having quite a lot of autonomy meant that there was a few different roads that people had traveled. So a lot of the change isn't necessarily in topic producers, it's actually in the method of integration in its entirety. So when we start to speak about benefits, the conversations around actually standardizing on one technology, and then the growth of that growing pool of available data to try new things and create new aggregations or new opportunities from that. And then particularly as our thinking's moved into the data mesh, has given us quite a big list of benefits that we can bring the organization. And it has been as much around selling that to our business stakeholders as it has been the tech teams, because they can see a world where, well, actually, if I've got access to this data and this data and this data, which I don't have at the moment, then we can try this new thing that I've wanted to do for years, and now all of a sudden I've got that opportunity. So influencing at both the business level around what bringing data together in one platform brings them, but then also working really closely with the tech teams as well to show what the technology move brings has been really good. And then because we're making that technology move as well, the conversation around metadata and decorative event definition is actually a benefit for them, in the sense that they know they don't have to go and work out how to write a new producer into Kafka. We've kind of got that baked into the technology move that's coming along with it as well. So we've not had to convince people to say, I'm producing stuff onto Kafka. There were two teams. Kafka's been around for a little while, and it's gone through its own kind of cycle of adoption where they've had to change. But those two teams, were kind of, what's the best way to describe it? They're happy to get on the adoption cycle quite early. So it was a good journey for us to actually use that as a starting point to bring in the metadata and use that as the kind of starting point for what that standardization looks like. Hopefully that answered the question.
I think it did. I think it worked quite well. So interesting insight. And then we've got one more here. If people want to, submit more with, I don't want to take up too much of your time, Jon. So we're coming up on the half hour, but I'm enjoying your answers. I think you've really thought through a lot of this stuff. So I appreciate it.
I'm happy to stay for a little while longer, Scott. Yeah. It's all good.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, next question then. Have you built any products not using event data, or is using only event data a core principle of building the mesh? This is a really good question. So it kind of links to my answer to the last one a little bit. As well as that kind of data move towards data mesh, we're still in the process of becoming event driven as an organization. So every domain or application that exists isn't necessarily producing events at the moment. So that means that we've naturally had to tackle the challenge of using data that isn't event data as part of that data product thinking and process as well. The challenge with this is us understanding where it's worthwhile doing that now versus where that team's intention to go event driven is as well, and how important the data is to the organization as well. So there's like a few strands to how we start to prioritize that. So if I can give a concrete example, our sales data is like critical to us understanding the performance of our organization, and that's used in a number of operational use cases, but it's also used in a number of analytical use cases, and has the eyes of the executive team on that data to make sure we're performing and doing what we need to do. But the challenge of transformation in that sales area to get to a point where it can be event driven is not an insignificant amount of work. There's quite a bit to do to get to that point, just because there's years worth of evolving of the organization that's happened around it. So if we were waiting for them to work through not only their feature backlog, but the event driven aspect of it, we wouldn't be taking that data into that data mesh anytime soon. So we have to look at the ways that we can use what we've got to feed that data products thinking as well. So to answer your question, it is a bit of a principle. It's a preferred approach, but it's not the only approach we've got. We're thinking through the other ways of taking data into that kind of data mesh world as well, as we start to break down that current kind of monolithic analytical workload that we've got at the moment.
Awesome. And a couple of questions that I've got dovetailing off of that, whichever one you want to go in, or neither. It's totally up to you. But one is kind of around the people process change, or around how you're driving even just this thinking, right? And that aspect of it, of like, what are you doing around people to kind of prep them for that this is coming, and get them bought in, and driving that kind of buy-in as to what do they get, and all of that. The other aspect, it's something that I chatted with Juana's Rosiers a little bit about, is you kind of have this with the event mesh, but like, how do you think about data on the threshold, right? Instead of data on the inside, data on the outside. And like, how do you make it so that people start to think about more of their data as potentially data that should be on the outside, or that they may want to be on the outside, and is that incentivization, or is that like a deeper discussion? Because Juana's was talking about what they've got is, they have it's kind of almost similar to the concept of the event mesh, but they've got data that is there that is not in a data mesh data product, right? It does not meet the full qualifications of quality and full SLAs and things like that, but it's still discoverable. So people can still find it and see that that data is there. And then if it's something where people really are like, I got to get at this data, I gotta see this more, or I need this with this SLA, then they go and they talk with that data owner, even though it's not a data product owner, because it's not a data product, but it's still, there's that there. And then, it might become a data product in data mesh or outside of data mesh, if it's, again, that this kind of operational exchange type of things where you've got that really, really optimized latency, and it's a single purpose kind of like set of pipelines where the pipeline is the first class concern and things. So like, either way, I think it's both are kind of thinking change, but like, have you started to approach that or initial thoughts on either side of driving that buy-in and driving the people process side? And then also like, how do we start to say, well, what more could we share? And is this going to be useful and valuable?
Yeah, definitely. I'll answer the second one first, because I love the word that you used for it, data on the threshold. I'm going to use that. But I think that is super important, actually, because I guess there's an element of like thinking about data on the threshold as the current landscape a little bit as well. Really, that act of cataloging what we've got and where the potential is and how we might approach that. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I've not thought this bit through that much, but I think data on I love it. That's staying with me. So I appreciate the question for that very reason itself. I think I'll have to go away and think about that one a little bit more, because there is work we're doing around cataloging what we've got in front of us now. But I think the interesting thing, the thing that jumped out at me a little bit was the data that might be within the teams from a technical perspective that maybe they should be sharing but they're not, and like how do we approach that? Like, it's like we can't really say, oh, you've got this data, by the way, unless we know they've got that data. And it's almost like it's on the other side of the threshold, isn't it? And it's so I think there's a lot to think through there. I'm happy with that. That's a good question.
And what do they get out of participating in data, right? Like that incentivization and that, hey, this is going to drive better insights, which is going to mean that your domain is more successful. It's kind of a conversation that I don't think there's any company thus far that has gotten finance to buy into data mesh. And what I mean by that is as a domain, not that they're saying putting the blockers on funding it and things like that. But finance is just saying, from all the companies I've talked to, finance is saying, no, absolutely not. We're not going to share any of our data. So like, how do you get them to dip their toe in the water? And like, how do you do that? And but you also don't want to put the burden on a domain of every bit of data you have to share. So you have to put all of your governance around it and all this stuff. And you can create kind of bloat, whether it's bloat in the data product itself or bloat in the number of data products. So it's that people process side and that really thinking through of, could this be useful, right? I have talked about myself as kind of a, my company DataStax is a little bit more in favor of Pulsar than Kafka, but of a Kafka broker, of taking that information and kind of publishing it at people, right? Of, hey, I think you might be interested in this. And how do you get that people to do that mindset shift of, hey, this might be useful, or hey, Intuit's post on their data mesh about the data product marketing of going and doing kind of data product discovery around, it might not be that they put everything into a data product, but they go and they say, hey, potential consumers, we've got these things. Let's just have a conversation about these are the things that we've got, that you don't have to say you have to put everything into a catalog and that you have to do all this extra work, versus a 30-minute conversation around, would this be useful? Like, is this something that people are interested in, and that we can dig deeper and start to define it? But you know, and not worrying that that's going to immediately create more backlog on the domain itself, right?
Well, that's the challenge, definitely.
I'm opening this up to the conversation, and if we do find it's useful, then how do I get more resource to make it so that I can share this?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, this comes back to your first question, obviously, and I think that people process bit has been something on mind. I think because of where we're at with data mesh itself, we're right at the start of that adoption cycle. So the big thing for us at the moment is finding the people who are open to trying new things a little bit as well, and using them as working with them to use it as an example of the benefits that we start to bring from that newer way of working effectively. And you know, there's candidates in that space all the time. Like we've seen through some of the event adoption, for example, the similar names crop up. You know, like, oh, we'll give this a try. So you kind of find that community of early adopters, no matter what it is you're talking about. You know, we've seen it across a few things. But then the other side of that, that's all well and good. But the other side is you know, spending a lot of time doing the thinking, being prepared to answer questions and talk through implications, and just being able to go and have those conversations like what you're saying. I think another kind of thing we've seen recently, you know, like the pandemic's been interesting because obviously we all got kind of forced to work from home for a large period, and I think some of these discussions that we'll have become a little harder. You know, it's not as easy to just jump on a whiteboard and start scribbling and saying, well, let's try this. And I think, you know, trying to find similar interactions throughout that period has probably made it a little more difficult than perhaps it had been in the past, but we're starting to see that come back a little bit. And then the other thing is just the benefits from that kind of organizational perspective as well. And, you know, working with people from the kind of business teams that will effectively be the eventual consumers of analytical data and what it means to them, and bringing that in. And you know, that cross-functional piece, you know, it applies not just to tech people, it applies to business people as well, and bringing them into that conversation, working together through that. And then the bit for us as a data team has been, well, how do we start to enable that treating data as a first-class citizen in that kind of application development process, and looking at our data engineers and how we can start to embed them into those teams. So whilst the team itself might not be doing all of the work, they've got a data engineer who's at the stand-ups and they're talking about data and they're asking the questions and they're getting that context and not context switching across domains, which is, you know, that kind of more that older approach of like that siloed horizontal of data engineering that kind of does everything and you switch in between stuff all of the time.
It's a pipeline monkey. They don't understand the context around this, so they can't, you know, it's kind of where I think data mesh is kind of a secret love letter to data engineers. Because it's this thing of like, we want to take you out of being this thing where all you are is an order taker. We want you to be part of that. So yeah.
Well, it's again, there's parallels. Like you go back not even that long ago, really, in the software development world, and you'd have people who were involved across all of the domains, and it's like, well, where's the biggest fire, or where's the biggest like feature request this week, and then next week you're like, okay, I've done this, now I'm doing something else. It's the same in data in a lot of places now, and it's applying those same lessons. It's just history repeating itself. to some degree. So I think even bringing those parallels with, like we've made these changes historically and look at the benefit we've got there, and we can do this the same. I spoke about DevOps, so it's the same thing. There's parallel lessons that we can draw on, that people are aware of, not only from a technology perspective now, but from a business perspective. Look at books like the Phoenix Project and the Unicorn Project. There's people who aren't technologists who will quite happily read those and get them and understand the benefits. And I think the Unicorn Project touches on some of the themes of data mesh, actually, probably towards the end. They start talking about event platforms and sharing data, and this was before data mesh was a thing. So that people have been thinking about this, and it's converging for a long time, and now it's like that explosion of ideas generating and taking us forward, and it's a really exciting place to be, I think, personally.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think just in general, that data on the inside, data on the outside of most companies haven't even done that at the kind of, I know operational plane, analytical plane, but like for those operational transactions, most companies still don't do that very well around the data on the outside, around sharing it. And that's kind of where data mesh scope kind of, people were like, oh, we're just going to put everything on the data mesh. And it's like, no, like you have to have this thing that's a first class analytical concern. But we understand that if the only place that you can get that data is the data mesh, and you need it for operational purposes, that's a really rough place to be for a company. So it's great that you've put in, I think, the work to make it so that you can have a successful data mesh, and that you're not going to have those, as many of those slippery slope kind of discussions. But it is a concern. But exactly what you said, a lot of people have called data mesh more of a found pattern rather than, or a discovered pattern rather than a, whole cloth invented by Schmack, because other people have been doing this similar concepts. But I think, data mesh is very, very specific in how Schmack views the actual application. But at the end of the day, it's creating this first class concern for your viewing these insights as not one-offs, right? I think a lot of people still view insights as, I got an idea, or I got something from this data. Okay, I don't have to look at this data again, versus like that repeatability of, you're not going to find the same insight, hopefully, over and over, but the repeatability of being able to generate insights is something that we haven't really done. And we've really only figured out how to do that very well on the operational side in the last maybe decade, but probably 5 years. So it's it's an interesting thing. So well, is there anything else that you think people should be thinking about, or is there any questions that you've got for the broader community that you'd like people to kind of talk to you about? But otherwise, would love to thank you for the time and all that. But
no, absolutely. I think the big thing for me is, just to thank the wider community. Like the Slack's a really active place. There's lots of lessons that I learned from there, and I think being a part of that and seeing it grow with your support, Scott, has been really super to see. So thanks to the community, but especially a thanks to you and for bringing me along today and just being able to share. Really, I think is the last thing I'd like to say today.
Well, again, thank you. This was a great presentation. I think you've summarized a ton of the stuff in a really, really concrete way. So I really liked a lot of what you said, and that you were able to kind of just sum it up into little bite-sized chunks and be open and honest. I think Andy mentioned that as well in the chat, and Gaurav specifically, yes, it'll be on the Data Mesh Learning YouTube. So if you just go to YouTube and search Data Mesh Learning, it'll be posted later. He's asking where the recording will be. But yeah, I think that you were very, very crisp about this stuff. So I really loved the chat and just chatting back and forth as well. So,
same, yeah, absolutely.
But well, so with that, I think we'll call it a day. But again, thank you everyone for joining, and especially obviously thank you, John. This was awesome, and we'll have the recording up soon. If anybody's got questions, feel free to ping me, and I'm assuming John in the Slack or LinkedIn, or what's the best way for people to reach you for questions and things for follow-up?
Yeah, Slack, LinkedIn, Twitter. I don't go on Twitter too often though, so you might wait a little while if that's your avenue of choice. But but yeah, reach out wherever you can find me. I'll answer questions quite happily.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you very much.